Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to log on and be a part of our conversation. And thanks to Eric for the tech help and Lindy for the invite. And as Eric mentioned, we'll have some time for Q&A not only at the end of the session, but also please feel free to type questions in as we go along, and I'll address those as best as we can. And also my email's on our very last slide, and the slides will be posted. So even if you have a question you're not quite sure about yet, feel free to follow up with me after, and I'll definitely get back in touch. So just a little bit about where we're headed today in terms of our roadmap. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and talk about what led me to this topic, undocumented Latino college students, and give you a little brief overview of my dissertation, and we'll get right into sharing some of the info from my literature review. So I'm actually in between 2 rounds of dissertation interviews right now, so I don't have any results or data-driven information to share just yet, but Lindy and I were hoping that maybe we could have a follow-up webinar next year when all of my data is analyzed and ready to go, and I could give you some results at that time. But in the meantime, hopefully some of the key information I found in the literature review is helpful in highlighting some themes about undocumented college students. And just a little bit about me. I'm currently a full-time doctoral student at Michigan State, and I'm particularly excited to be working with you all because I used to be in housing. So I started as an RA and was a graduate hall director, and worked in Ohio and Arizona as a full-time hall director. So I used to work with AIMHO. So it's very exciting to be chatting with some housing folks. And when Lindy invited me to share my work on this topic, I was excited. But I also had to let her know that unfortunately there is not a lot of information out there yet in terms of translating theory to practice for serving this student population, especially for housing in particular. Many undocumented students aren't able to live on campus for financial reasons and due to family obligations and expectations regarding staying at home and providing for their families. And many undocumented students access higher ed through community college. But the good news is many of the students in my dissertation sample, although none of them live on campus, they expressed hope that they would be able to do so in the near future. They really have this image of the quintessential college experience and wanting to live on campus and connect in that way. So although housing-specific literature is hard to come by with this topic, maybe one of you all could be a pioneer in that area, and I think Lindy just mentioned Katie is doing a Twitter chat. So it's still helpful to have a working knowledge of some of the common challenges, though, and overall experiences undocumented college students face, even though there may not be a high percentage of these students in your on-campus housing. And also, I think some other reasons I'm interested in this topic overall, I find that this isn't really in our daily dialogue as student affairs educators, although these students are present at our institutions of higher education. So it's a little bit of a hidden segment of our student population. And I feel very fortunate in my student affairs work to do what I find personally and professionally rewarding in regards to social justice work. So I feel strongly about that and the ability to serve all of our students. So essentially I saw a need for opening up these conversations, and I had an interest in learning more about these students. So that's really what led me to my dissertation topic, and I found it a little bit timely given the pressing issues we're seeing in the media and with some political issues and concerns with immigration debate. So these students are present in our institutions of higher education, and even with increasing numbers, in fact. So of course I picked a rather hotly contested issue for my dissertation, as if the process isn't difficult enough. But as any good housing professional knows, we don't shy away from a good challenge that we feel strongly about if we think it's going to help our students and also help us to learn and grow. So with that, though, there are a few limitations to my study, and I think for me, I'm by no means a legal expert. I have no law background, but there's no way to study the student population without addressing the policy climate in the past as well as current legal battles. But I'll set the stage with a few contexts in terms of laws and policies. But my goal is to really center the student voice and really hear student stories and their lived experiences as a result of their status as an undocumented student. And I actually started this project, at the time I didn't know it, but it turned out to be a pilot study for my dissertation. It was a class project I co-authored with Christina Yao, who was in my cohort, and she also used to work in housing in the Midwest. And during that time, the DREAM Act was actually coming up for a second vote, and as we know, that failed. But again, through all that, my goal was really to hear directly from the students and learn about their experiences to ultimately inform best practice. And I find that, people who are curious about these students' experiences are still, highly impacted by the dialogue going on outside of higher education regarding undocumented students with immigration debate. So with that, a few significant points, I think, are economically speaking, as a country, we can't afford to have some of our people who live here, regardless of citizenship status, have their abilities not cultivated to contribute to the greater good. So, one of the things I set forth in my problem statement in my dissertation is really emphasizing that we've already spent resources on undocumented students who are allowed to attend K-12 education. And so we can really realize this investment by helping these students pursue higher education so they can work and participate meaningfully to our society. And we want the best and brightest students in our colleges. So it's a small group of extremely talented and motivated students who have already overcome multiple obstacles in their schooling. So their desire and readiness to attend college shows that they have a lot of perseverance and potential for future success. And many of these students, which you'll hear referred to as the 1.5 generation, have received most of their education in the U.S. And some research by Gonzalez, which is one of the leading researchers in this area, says these students, their mannerisms, interests, aspirations are identical to those of their American-born peers. And also, many of these students are bicultural. So many are fluent in English, but their bicultural and bilingual skills are an asset at any level and really give us an advantage in a global economy. And as the U.S. was once seen as a global leader with educated citizens contributing to a knowledgeable workforce, we've actually dropped in prestige. And so the College Board actually has a report out detailing the crisis of achievement gaps for students from low-income backgrounds and minority students, which includes undocumented Latino students often. And this education deficit really threatens our global competitiveness and economic future in terms of the U.S. having educated citizenry and workforce in a global economy. And beyond that, the ethical and humanistic standpoint. So I feel our professional ethics as university educators, we're responsible for creating an environment that serves all students and cultivates their success, gives everyone a chance to become a talented graduate with an opportunity for upward mobility. So really, student affairs professionals have a great responsibility and opportunity to assist and support the academic and social success of all students, including those from undocumented families. And along with that, one of the first steps we can take in this complex issue is really just developing the capacities to support these students through a working knowledge of how these students are persisting in some of the challenges they may face in the face of especially rapidly shifting legal and political climates. And so also when undocumented students see that student affairs professionals know about their situation and demonstrate an ethic of care regarding these unique qualities, they're able to develop some trust with us because we may not be able to readily identify undocumented students, but if they see through the use of our language and the types of programs we're hosting and attending, perhaps they'd be more likely to use our support services and reach out to us for help. So with that, those are a few reasons why I'm interested in the topic, personally and professionally. But I always like to start with a little bit about definitions and language because there are a lot of different terms thrown out. And as with many diverse student populations, some terms are generally accepted as more preferred over others. So sometimes we'll hear the term illegal alien or unauthorized, but generally those are thought to be quite dehumanizing. So you'll hear me use the term undocumented, which is usually the preferred term that my students will use to self-identify as well. And then something a little funky, a lot of times people think I have a really bizarre typo, but the little @ symbol you'll see at the end of Latino, Latina, I actually chose that over the more common use of Latino to represent gender neutrality and gender inclusion and kind of disrupt the normative privileging over masculinity and the way language plays out. So just a small bit in how I chose to write in my dissertation, so you'll see that in some of the slides. And also a few other notes that I always like to keep in mind for myself is to not essentialize. So I speak about undocumented Latino students as a group, but of course it's a very diverse group, and that's quite the umbrella term. And also to keep in mind there are many other undocumented groups, so from various areas of the world. But I chose a Latina group because it's one of the largest numbers of undocumented citizens in terms of people on our campus as well as in the U.S., and it's a growing number. And they're often in the face of policy debates and legal debates. So maybe in setting up my research trajectory in the years beyond, once I graduate, I can look at some other groups and make some comparisons. But my literature review specifically focuses on Latino students, undocumented Latino students. And many of these students used to be very much in the shadows for real reasons. They could face detention or deportation for themselves or their families. But now students are increasingly finding personal empowerment through political activism. So folks are always curious how I found participants for my study. Excuse me, and I think one of the really wonderful things is students are really finding their voice on campus and off campus in terms of community involvement and activism, and are more than willing to share their experiences. And then just in terms of undocumented, National Immigration Law Center has a commonly used definition in terms of a foreign national who entered the U.S. without inspection or with fraudulent documents, or someone who entered legally as a non-immigrant but then violated the terms of the status and remained in the U.S. without authorization. So I've actually had both scenarios for some of the students I've spoken with. They came at a very young age, but some were able to get temporary documentation with their families, but they overstayed that, and then the system's really difficult to work within to document once again. But most college-bound undocumented students have lived in the U.S. Most of their lives. They've learned English at a young age and attended K-12 school here in the U.S. Many complete high school and are very high achieving academically and want to pursue a college education, but currently lack a way to become a legal resident or citizen of the U.S., and we'll see why that presents particular barriers for the student population. And then one more note, you'll hear me use Latino, Latina. I chose that term in particular quite intentionally to represent a diverse ethnic umbrella, excuse me, and a broad spectrum of geographic backgrounds. So we'll note that there are various terms and preferred terms by students, but I chose that to represent students coming from areas including Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, other Central and South American countries. But I also give my interview participants in my study the opportunity to give any additional details on how they identify. I think that's a really important piece in terms of empowerment and allowing them to share their story. And again, the term Generation 1.5 refers to the immigrants who were brought to the U.S. as young children and identify as American. And many of these students have no memory of growing up in another country and do consider the U.S. their home. And another interesting piece I'm finding, students may come from mixed status families. So some family members may be undocumented while others do have documentation. So some of these students have younger siblings in particular who were born in the U.S. and are citizens by birthright. So in my dissertation study, you can see here the main purpose, as I mentioned, and to achieve that goal, this is my primary research question, as you can see, and I'm really asking some open-ended interview questions of these students and letting them kind of share their journey. So most of the research that's already out there is regarding the K-12 pipeline and the access to higher education, as well as the funding, which is one of the main barriers. So I really wanted to see what was going on with students who had overcome those pieces and were already in higher education. Like, what was their experience once they're enrolled and they've made it through year one. So my sample would be anyone who's made it through year one, so second, third, fourth year students, I do have a fifth-year student, as well as anyone who's 2 years out from graduation. So these students are in a good position to show how they've demonstrated some resilience in navigating higher education, because they're making progress to a degree, which is one of my definitions of demonstrating resilience. So they have this persistence in behavior leading towards graduation, because all too often there's a deficit model used when describing the experiences of these students, meaning there's some blaming going on based on the students and their circumstances as to why they're not achieving, as opposed to looking at the educational institutions and how that's factoring in. Also, these students have at least a 2.0 GPA. So in demonstrating resilience, that means they've been able to maintain what is commonly defined as good academic standing. And with the resilience theory as a way to overcome the deficit model that's commonly used, I'm also using a framework of critical race theory and Latino critical theory. So those are really putting me in tune with issues such as gender, race, ethnicity, immigration status, family, language, all of these puzzle pieces that come together to form these holistic experiences these students are having. So I've spoken with, in my pilot study, we had 3 students, and for my dissertation, I was aiming 15 to 20. Right now I have 16. I'd love to get a few more. It's a nationwide sample, so anywhere in the U.S. at a 4-year institution. And I'm hoping to get a pretty diverse sample of students in terms of policy climate, because a student who goes to school in California is likely to have a very different experience than someone in Georgia that has a very restrictive policy for students in college that are undocumented. So these interviews are taking place on the phone or via Skype audio, so no video, just to protect people's identities and what can be considered often a vulnerable population. So with that, even though I mentioned earlier I would really like to focus on student stories and their counter-narratives, I'd be remiss not giving a little bit of legal background for those who aren't familiar, because it can be a little confusing. As I mentioned, current policies are very rapidly shifting. So a brief overview of some main ones here, and then it's actually followed by a map of state-by-state laws and policies on access. And then I'll show you a map on state-based in-state tuition policies, since the funding piece is such a big aspect for these students. So Plyler versus Doe is the 1982 Supreme Court ruling, and it determined that a K-12 education is a fundamental and protected right. So it's provided to all children in the United States, regardless of citizenship or residency status. So that's wonderful until students get to high school and realize, many of my students didn't know they were undocumented until that time. They go to apply to college and then realize they can't get a job legally and they have no viable opportunity for higher education and attaining a degree and getting a job after that. And then the DREAM Act, the Development, Relief, and Education of Alien Minors Act, is one you probably heard in the media quite recently again. It was introduced into the U.S. Senate as legislation in 2001, and it would have allowed undocumented youth to earn conditional permanent residency, but it actually failed to pass a vote in December 2010. But since then, there have been some state-based DREAM Acts, which we'll touch on briefly, and also many student activist groups. You may hear the name Dreamers, so students have kind of embraced this as a hopeful piece of legislation and named themselves Dreamers after these political efforts. And so some of the more popular or common things to hear in the media are regarding Texas and California, and also in the literature, because these states both have legislation that have helped students access higher education through funding policies. So Texas House Bill 1430 from 2001 grants undocumented students access to in-state tuition rates at Texas public institutions. That includes having state financial aid. So there are a few things students have to do to qualify for this, such as residing in Texas with a parent or guardian while attending high school, having graduated or received a GRD, and also signing an affidavit indicating their intent to apply for permanent resident status as soon as they're able to do so. Very similar in California with AB 540, also from 2001, and provides in-state tuition for undocumented students. And so many states, as we'll see, actually have policies that require undocumented students to pay out-of-state tuition or even international student rates. And that's particularly difficult because undocumented students can't get jobs legally. But DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, has been a recent development that's actually turned that situation around for many students. And it's an interesting one because it was announced during my study. So many participants experienced some pretty life-changing circumstances as we were in the middle of our interviews and corresponding. So they shared a great feeling of hope and joy with DACA. Some were awarded this and others are in the process. And it was announced June of 2012. It's a policy that allows eligible undocumented youth to receive a 2-year deferment of their deportation and will also grant work authorization. So there are definitely some restrictions that go along that as well, but ultimately it targets the college-age, traditional age student population, as you can't be above the age of 30 to receive DACA. I just wanted to let you take a quick look at this. And although this is from February of 2013, things are still changing. In fact, I think it was Minnesota just this week came out with some in-state developments. And you'll see Georgia, as I mentioned earlier, is a state that's actively intentionally to deny enrollment to undocumented students, whereas some other states in the Southwest have some pretty open policies in terms of recruiting and opening up access pathways. And then just to give you a little glimpse, this is about a year old, but in terms of the actual tuition policy. So once a student can get in, how are they going to pay for this? So you can see here many states are unstipulated. So that's one of the pressing issues here, is they're pretty ambiguous in terms of laws and policies, as we don't have a federally mandated law or policy regarding access or tuition yet. So states and specific institutions are left to decide. So that brings us to, I don't see any questions on here yet or anything in the chat, but Eric, pop in if you get anything that I'm not seeing. Otherwise, I'll hop right into some of the literature and explain to you kind of how I had to conceptualize this, because there's not a lot out there on undocumented Latino college students, as I mentioned. So to kind of form a foundation and a base of knowledge, I went back to literature on Latina K-12 students and college students, and then a little bit in undocumented Latina students in K-12, since they are able to be actively present in our K-12 system. Really, it's tricky because the challenges to educational success begin so early in students' K-12 experiences. They continue through the educational pipeline. So things we're seeing from the Latina K-12 population, such as being marginalized and disenfranchised in many communities, having limited financial resources, being in underserved school districts oftentimes, having challenges relationships with teachers and barriers to familial involvement, and the need for some stronger learning communities with teachers, mentors, and peers. These are all things that come up in the literature. And all of these things transfer right over to undocumented Latina students in the K-12 system. And on top of that, there's some legal concerns, additional limited financial resources. Oftentimes one parent will come to the U.S. to work while another is in the home country, for example, so a family has been split up. And oftentimes there's a lack of bilingual and appropriate ESL programs for these students. Also, these students face stigma by their teachers, their low teacher expectations, and a perceived lack of parental involvement, which is particularly interesting because many families bring their young children to the U.S. because they think there's a better educational opportunity and a better system for the students, but they don't necessarily have the social or cultural capital to get involved in our school system in the U.S. and in a way that's meaningful for the student, the family, and connects well with the teacher. So all of these things are building up to the experiences that undocumented Latino college students have had, because many Latino college students are overrepresented as first-generation students. And as we know, some challenges come with that, again, with having limited cultural and social capital and knowing how to navigate a college campus. Coming from a low SES background and underserved K-12 system, So that really relates to limited resources in academic preparation. And that translates to difficulties in college application process, admissions, financing, and many students attending community colleges as a gateway into higher education. And for many, community colleges are a great opportunity, but are also called a gatekeeper because a lot of these students really want, as I mentioned, this quintessential four-year college experience where they see the greatest opportunity for themselves, but they have difficulty transferring out of the community college system and feel there's really limited opportunity for that. So with that, let's move to the next slide. This is a slide I wanted to highlight. You'll see listed in my references at the end. William Perez is one of the leading researchers and has some phenomenal books out on undocumented students. And he mainly researches the pipeline, like K through 12 and accessing higher ed. So not as much about the experiences of students already in higher ed, which I'm hoping to focus on. But a lot of the themes you'll see here in his framework in terms of access and student achievement come up in the work I've been doing. So you'll see the word support multiple times. So coming from a collectivistic culture, support is really key in the success of these students. And also with that, these students tend to be, as I mentioned earlier, really high achieving in terms of academics, very involved in their school as well as in their community. So these leadership skills that they possess, as well as excelling academically and having these hopes and dreams of going to college and contributing back to their families, as well as to their schools and communities, are all key issues in terms of what's driving these students to access college. And then in the graphic you'll see here is actually the cover of one of William Perez's books that I recommend picking up if you have access to it. It's really phenomenal in terms of exploring, again, the educational pipeline for undocumented Latino students. But with that, it brings us to the undocumented Latino college students, which we've built up this foundation of some things that follow them throughout education, and then some of the laws and policies that impact them. So a majority of the literature, as I mentioned, really focuses on national and state policies and how students are just accessing and financing post-secondary education. So I really want to know, again, what students are doing once they're in college, what their experiences are. But because they are often first-generation college students from low SES background, they have limited resources and knowledge about the legalities and options surrounding college access. So many of these students weren't even aware that they could go to college, and once they did find out they could go, they weren't quite sure how to navigate that process. So a study by Garcia in 2011 showed that undocumented Latino students matriculating to college had three major issues to face. So institutional agents were instrumental in developing students' social capital. They're not getting it from peers and family, not for a lack of effort, but it's just a completely new environment for them. Family and peer-based social capital is important to students' matriculation, so acknowledging the importance of family and peers, and again, this community collectivistic background, and then perceptions about immigration status affecting students. So, students are facing the psychological burden of hearing all of the same debate we hear on TV and in the media, and several of my participants have said, yeah, that's not an abstract concept, that's me that people are talking about. So the day-to-day conversations that are taking place are really impacting our students on a very personal level. And so it's been found by Perez and some other researchers that college-going undocumented Latino students are not typical students. They are extremely high-achieving academically and very involved in their schools and communities. And they've overcome great personal adversity to be in a country that's not investing in their human capital. So these students are seeking higher education in an attempt to improve their chances for upward social mobility and incorporation into mainstream U.S., although they face the very real and bleak reality that currently they may not be able to get a job or use their degree or go on for even further higher education. Several members of my student population have expressed that they really want to go to grad school. They want to be a doctor, a lawyer, a vet, a teacher, but they know at this point that's really not possible. And so along with that, these students have this personal drive, but are also driven by their family. So I already mentioned maintaining close familial ties is very important in terms of Latino cultural norms. And these students are expected to provide economic support for their family and care for elders as well as role model for younger siblings. So this additional area of expectation is particularly intense for these students, as many times they've expressed their parents brought them here because they want to have better educational opportunities. But students are embracing these expectations. So many of the values they've witnessed in their families, like hard work and determination, have been applied to pursuing their own academic goals, and they really want to make their parents proud. In terms of campus climate, there are a few things that students have expressed in the literature and in my interviews that I think is important for us to keep in mind. Many students don't feel a sense of safety or belonging on campus, and all students need to feel this engagement with our environment and valued as a member of the campus community. So with that, you know, the collectivistic community-oriented culture that I've mentioned really leads these students to yearn for this sense of belonging. One researcher interviewed several students and found that undocumented students were feeling less included on campus, and that inclusion was under threat constantly because their immigration status is equivalent to being illegal, and it results in social isolation. And the importance of peer relationships, which we know applies to all of our students, is really significant, and there are several constraints these students face. So because they don't have a social security number and they can't obtain a driver's license, they're not able to vote, to attend social scenes with peers, such as a bar or an evening event requiring age-verifying IDs. And they also have to rely heavily on public transportation or risk driving without a license. So these limited opportunities socially lead to some stress for our students. And many undocumented students are reporting modifying their academic and social activities and behaviors just to minimize the possibility of being identified as undocumented by school officials or law enforcement. So the presence of supportive university educators along with visible role models and mentors are really important pieces for these students because they face these additional barriers. And undocumented students are a somewhat hidden segment of our student population, but we generally don't know a lot about their experiences and how to effectively serve them. And some students mentioned, you know, they've encountered some very well-intentioned, well-meaning educators, and that means a lot as long as someone's willing to go the extra mile and go find the information that they need for the student. But on the flip side, some students said that they've encountered some completely unsupportive administrators and faculty members when it comes to seeking assistance or just having someone to chat with on campus. So personal political beliefs and biases may interfere. And so these issues may manifest in many ways, but they certainly don't go unnoticed by our undocumented students. And then with that, many undocumented students experience stigma and fear. So they always have this burden on their mind of potential arrest or deportation for themselves or their family. So again, this psychological burden that could be really an interrupting factor in schooling, focusing on academics. One of my participants in the pilot study talked about being taken from his home in front of his mother and his little brother because his dad wasn't home to take. So when ICE, or Immigration Customs Enforcement, came, they took him and put him out of state in 2 months in a detention center. But even in the face of this uncertainty and danger, when he thought he was going to be deported to a country he didn't know and felt would be dangerous for him, his main focus was getting in touch with his institution for missing a chemistry exam. And he did not want that to impact his GPA because he wanted to be a doctor. So he was later released, but at the time of the pilot study, he was still working with his academic dean to complete his interrupted coursework. His institution had never dealt with a situation like this and wasn't particularly proactive in helping him just with the basics of dropping that class or finding a way to recoup the grade from that chemistry exam. And also with the stigma and the current highly political, volatile nature of current immigration debates, a lot of undocumented students are stating they're facing some prejudices on campus, and other students expressing openly that they feel undocumented students aren't deserving of a spot in our institutions of higher education, and that they have an innate inferiority and inability to continue towards higher education degrees. And with that, a lot of these students also have this emotional and mental strain with this fear of deportation and being judged by peers and being found out. And so students really try their best to many students, to keep their head down and plow through their academics. And they find a way to connect with some students and disclose their status, oftentimes through community groups or even institutional groups that are open and welcoming for undocumented students. So they'll connect with other students as well as advisors and university faculty and staff who attend the events or volunteer to be an advisor of sorts for these groups. And that's a way to overcome some of those challenges. So in terms of professional development limitations, I mentioned students are highly involved and they're connecting with others through student groups. But unfortunately, they're blocked from some important activities preventing full participation in campus life. So, for example, career counseling and planning processes that would typically take place may not be relevant to undocumented students, not only because of values related to ethnicity and familial commitments, but also students' inability to travel freely or provide documentation. So, for example, certain majors require identification for site visits, clearance, background checks, travel restrictions. So many of my students wanted to be a teacher, but once they realized that they were unable to student teach, they had to switch majors. So misinformation about realistic opportunities for choosing a major and a life path and career has some pretty tangible repercussions for these students in terms of they're struggling to pay high tuition rates and they may have to switch major mid-college career. So that's an additional time commitment strain as well, and the emotional burden of this blocked opportunity. I had a student who was an engineer, and as a part of that major, they were required to study abroad. And he didn't realize it until his junior year, but he wasn't able to go abroad. So he had to change majors that late in the game, and his advisor just didn't know how to help him. And so many of these students, as I mentioned, have a strong desire to attend graduate school, but there are limited opportunities in terms of entrance exams, especially for law and medicine, that often require identification that these students can't provide. So one of my students mentioned a process where a faculty member, a trusted faculty member who he had disclosed his identity to, went with him to one of these exams and vouched for him. And they actually let him in the exam, and he was able to take it and just got into law school. But I also have stories of other students who attempted something similar and were barred from even entering the room and taking the exam. As a sort of alternative, it's not quite the same, but some things that are coming up in the literature and that students are mentioning just recently in terms of not being able to study abroad is a study away in the U.S. So finding meaningful cross-cultural experiences for students to learn and grow that are realistic for them in terms of travel. And then on a positive note, I mentioned a lot of the literature that's out there isn't the most hopeful, but in terms of students' activism, many of these students, as I mentioned, are highly active in their communities. So student organizations have been pivotal for them in connecting to their identities, connecting to other students, and finding supportive faculty and staff members. So some of these organizations are political in nature, where others are social. So having a safe space where they can go on campus has been really key for them in connecting with others. So informal social networks are also really key, and showing support for students. One institution has sort of like a safe zone sticker that would commonly be thought of for LGBT communities. They have a safe space sticker for undocumented students. So students benefited from seeing this on folks' office doors or in meeting spaces they could use in the union, and even faculty members would have this on their office doors. So with that, there's really a need for educational practice reform because these students are present in our institutions of higher education, regardless of how some may feel politically or personally. These students are certainly in need of services and receiving some accurate information and support from staff. So gathering as much information as possible, knowing one's limitations, but also how to connect students to others is really important. And in practice, one of the resources I've left you with, the Educators for Fair Consideration, gives some tips for supporting undocumented students. So things like providing hope and encouragement. I keep mentioning, there's this psychological and emotional burden, but letting students know they do have a place at your institution, and and to remain hopeful about the future and to plan well and stay on track and really engage in that support network that I showed is so important. Creating that safe space where students don't have to self-identify, but know you're an ally and you have resources available. So similar to things we would do for other diverse student groups, like remaining mindful of language, such as saying undocumented rather than illegal. And again, knowing relevant policies and legislation and where to find scholarships and other reputable legal information for students, as well as building support networks and identifying role models. So this could be mentors or tutors, older undocumented students on campus that can role model the way, or even reaching out to educate parents and involve people's families and even younger siblings. Instilling a sense of agency, so creating this safe community where undocumented students can speak openly and get involved to a level that's comfortable for them. And then just being there, as we do for any of our students, to listen and not make assumptions and help solve problems, but ultimately help them solve any concerns they may have. And remain a public ally and remind students that their dreams and passions and potential to contribute, to not lose sight of that in the face of all this. So ultimately, one of the main takeaways so far that I've pieced together is creating this environment that's open and comfortable and respectful, as we would with any human difference. So I think those are all key aspects for working with any diverse student population, but specifically undocumented Latino college students who have these additional challenges to face. So that was a lot of information in a short period of time. But that wraps up pretty much the literature review portion. I don't see any questions popped up, but I would like to give a few minutes for anyone to type any in now, or if they have ideas or things, challenges or ideas that you're using right now in your own work. And thank you so much for being here. I'll go ahead and advance to the next slide so you can kind of check out these resources as you type questions. There are many leading scholars that are just phenomenal to read. But I just pulled out a few here that have been really instrumental in shaping my thinking and my dissertation work. No pressure if you don't have any questions right now and you're just kind of letting the information marinate still. As I mentioned, my email's on the last page here coming up, and please feel free to contact me anytime. I love to chat about it, and I'm continuing to learn so much myself. So thank you again so much for taking the time out to attend today. Hopefully you learned something new or interesting or useful, and you can maybe share it with others. And I'd love to hear your ideas because I'm still mid-dissertation, so I'm always looking to improve my work as I go along. With that, I think Eric will hop in here in a minute, but feel free to type any last-minute questions.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie Jo. This is such a relevant topic in higher education, and I found it very informative. And I want to thank you for presenting on this today. This is the last call for questions. None have come in, and that's okay. If you do have any questions that you don't feel comfortable submitting now, or if you think of something later, please email Leslie. But seeing as that we have none, this will be the conclusion of today's webinar. As I mentioned, the recording will be available on our website, probably starting tomorrow. Hope everybody's having a great summer, and thanks for joining us today. Have a great day.